Hello and welcome to DELTRA Australia. My name is Rondell Johannesson and I'm the founder and the Managing Director of DELTRA Australia. Over the last 15 years I've had a lot of people ask me what is it exactly that I need to do when it comes to emergency planning and training. And so I thought today I'd give you a brief overview of what legislation and Australian standards there are to be used in terms of emergency planning and training, and that way it will at least guide you to exactly where that information is so that you can investigate even further. The first piece of legislation that I wanted to talk about is the Work Health and Safety Act 2011. Now within that act there is of course a duty to be undertaken by people who operate a business for the health and safety of everyone involved. And as part of that act there is the Work Health and Safety Regulation 2011. Now if you have a look at that regulation, part 3.2 talks about general workplace management, and division 4 of that part specifically talks about emergency plans. And it clearly states within the regulation in section 43 that a person conducting a business or undertaking at a workplace has a duty to prepare, maintain and implement an emergency plan. So it's very important that you do refer to this legislation because it is a national law within Australia and it must be abided by. Within the Work Health and Safety Act regime, there's also a list of code of practices, and one of those is called Managing the Work Environment and Facilities Code of Practice 2011. Now if you refer to that code of practice, it specifically talks about the section on emergency plans, where it is a requirement to prepare emergency procedures. Now it does give you guidelines on how to do that and exactly what they mean by preparing emergency procedures. But one of the main things I want to point out is that within this code of practice, they do refer to the Australian standard AS 3745, which is 2010, which is called Planning for Emergencies in Facilities. Now this Australian standard is seen as best practice to be used throughout Australia. The standard gives you a very good guide on how to organise and develop the emergency plan and procedures regime within your organisation. It's divided into a number of sections. The first one talks about the emergency planning committee, so you need a group of people together who are going to develop and implement the emergency plan. It talks about the emergency plan and what should be incorporated into that. Also the emergency response procedures and how to set up an emergency control organisation, or as we often call them, wardens, to look after the safety of people within the workplace. It does talk about training, what the recommended requirements for training are, and it also talks about doing evacuation and emergency response exercises. And lastly, AS 3745 does talk about regular review and maintenance of those procedures. So it is a very good document for you to get your hands on. It's available from Standards Australia. So if you do a Google search, AS 3745 year 2010, you will be able to find where to purchase that document. Another one which is closely related to that is the Australian Standard 4083, also dated 2010, and it's called Planning for Emergencies Healthcare Facilities. Now this document really is only used in healthcare facilities such as hospitals, nursing centres, aged care facilities, anywhere where there are people who may have difficulty in evacuating themselves and they need that extra help to do that. And so this document should be read in conjunction with AS 3745. Once again, it is purchased from Standards Australia. If you do a Google search on AS 4083 2010, then you should be able to find where to purchase that document. Now, some of the different states and territories around the country do have specific legislation that must be abided by. And the most stringent of these is Queensland, where they have the Building Fire Safety Regulation 2008. Now that regulation has a whole part 4, which talks about evacuation planning, instruction and practice. and there are very quite stringent requirements in terms of emergency planning and training within that regulation. So if you are in Queensland, I strongly recommend that you look up the Building Fire Safety Regulation 2008 and have a look at Part 4 at the requirements there. One of the main points of interest within that regulation is that it does call for what they call a fire safety advisor within a high occupancy building. So, you know, if you work in a building that has a lot of staff or is in a particular type of industry, then you may be required to appoint a fire safety advisor for your site. So it's very important that if you are in Queensland, you do refer to this regulation, because it is the law within Queensland and it must be abided by. Once again, in Queensland, there's also the Fire and Rescue Service Act 1990, and if you have a look at section 104E, they also talk to you about emergency planning and training and what the requirements are there. I won't go into that in great detail because it's more important that you actually have a look at the Building Fire Safety Regulation 2008. If you are in Tasmania, then there are the General Fire Regulations 2010, and there is a requirement there once again for you to develop an emergency plan, and it specifically states that emergency plan should be developed in line with AS 3745, where it applies within the Tasmanian context. So once again, if you are in Tasmania, then I strongly recommend that you look up the Tasmanian Fire Regulations, General Fire Regulations they're called, 2010, and that will give you the information on what is required in terms of your emergency plan. Also within those Tasmanian General Fire Regulations, they do talk about having an annual evacuation practice. So that, once again, that is legislation within Tasmania. So you must make sure that you are conducting those regular evacuation practices if you are working within that state. So that just gives you a very brief overview of what legislation exists out in Australia with regard to emergency planning and training. There is more information on our website at www.deltraaustralia.com, and of course, if you do have any questions, we're always happy to help. You can email your questions to info@deltraaustralia.com, or you can call us on 1300 830 570. So I hope that information today has served you and helped you in some way, and certainly I hope it does give you guidance on how you can or where you can find information to start getting your emergency plan up and running within your organisation. So thanks for your time today, and bye for now.